Good afternoon. My name is Ben Mcdonald. I'm the author of Rebirding and I'm a Bristol resident, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you all today. I think even in the most urban areas, we have extraordinary opportunities, even in the smallest of green spaces, to turn around an enormous nature recovery in the west of England. And, whether that's combating ecological tidiness disorder by leaving our hedgerows gloriously tall and scruffy, whether that's cutting meadows later, whether that's joining up hedgerows and woodlands, there's an enormous amount that we can do on our doorstep that will lead to significant nature recovery beyond what many of us might even imagine. But in this talk, I'd like to take you through some of the big picture visions for rewilding that I hope can inspire us and take us on that journey together. So the good news is that the impending mass extinction of our wildlife, which we do face, is completely avoidable, and here's why. Only 6% of our country is built upon. 83% of us live in urban areas. That's a much higher percentage than in many parts of the world, giving us places larger than the Masai Mara and Yellowstone in the United Kingdom, albeit not necessarily in the west of England, for epic acts of large-scale nature restoration. So we have a fundamental contradiction in our country whereby we have more nature-loving voices than the lobbies that oppose nature, and yet we have ostensibly the worst and most depleted wildlife on the continent, and we have been the slowest to restore keystone species like the beaver. So why are we talking about wildlife decline if so many of us love it? So let's take the long view of how we got here in order to work out how we can get back to a much better place. The vast majority of our animals are shaped not by the actions of people in an evolutionary sense, but the actions of animals, many of which we have entirely forgotten. Not only were there the enormous glacial periods, but there were the interglacial periods when species like straight-tusked elephants and birds like shrikes, which are elephant evolved, would have been living in the United Kingdom as well. And once upon a time, hippos, elephants, rhinos, and of course the meso herbivores like aurochs and bison later on would have played a profound role in shaping the avifauna and the fauna of the United Kingdom. We need to remember, therefore, what is natural and what is not. A dense canopy woodland is what forms in the absence of giant animals. That doesn't necessarily make it natural. It simply means that the large animals have been removed over time, removed from the landscape, and also removed from our consciousness as well. This is the Latea forest in the Danube Delta. This is as close to a natural woodland landscape at the large scale that it's possible to see. And as you can see, it resembles in many ways the New Forest. It's the interplay of free-roaming horses and cattle with the formation of trees. What you get is a mosaic landscape. You keep the grasslands and the woodlands and the scrublands. You get something that it is very hard to design once those keystone animals are taken out of the picture. Natural landscapes are broken, chaotic, shifting, and cyclical. They are not continuous habitats, which is why in some ways early forms of farmland can actually be extraordinarily beneficial, for example, in places like Romania, because you have that broken landscape. The herbivore is eminently more disruptive than any four-legged animal. The herbivore is ourselves, but acting in ways that replicate natural processes. But looking at these landscapes here, we have the Serengeti, we have the Bieszczba marshes in Poland, we have Karna National Park in India, and we have the Knepp Estate here in Britain, in Sussex, where natural processes are at work. You get something that is broken, chaotic, and diverse, and that is what we need to be working towards in nature restoration in the years to come. A lot of these species, a lot of our birds in particular, the hawfinch used to breed in west of England, I don't believe does anymore, tied to a very varied landscape with fruit trees, with shade-loving trees, light-loving trees. The humble robin, of course, still doing very well in Bristol, tied to mammalian disturbance, traditionally wild boar, and now ourselves. So many of our birds have evolved in a chaotic and broken landscape, and we need to be mindful of that when we're talking about blanket categories of habitats like woodland, grassland. The whole point is all of those habitats are designed to coexist and to intermingle. Early prototypes of RSPB, or indeed Wildlife Trust, or indeed any site managers: elk, wild cattle, horses, boar, red deer, other species of deer, of course, and bison. Species that would have contested the growth of vegetation and created something more open and more diverse than simply blanket canopy woodland. But this is particularly relevant to any of us living alongside the River Severn, for example, is that we have to remember that before we tamed and drained rivers, Somerset and indeed areas of North Somerset would have looked like this. This is the Pripyat marshes in Belarus, the largest pristine, intact river wetland system in Europe. And the river is still very much in charge. Now, we can't even imagine what that landscape would have looked like in Britain. We have to look to other countries. But when we think about wetland restoration, again, we're not just talking about blanket reed bed. We're talking about allowing rivers to do what rivers are supposed to do in order to shape the land to maximal advantage. So allowing the river to expand, to contract, allowing beavers, of course, to aid that process. And, we're talking about wetland woodlands, home to species like black stork, which we know were present in Britain in Roman times. And of course, we're talking about species like Dalmatian pelican, capable of exploiting these huge areas to find the fish that they need in order to survive. All of these creatures would at some point, certainly in the Roman era, and in the beaver's case later, have been living in the west of England. The Dalmatian pelican, the beaver, the ruff, and the spotted crake. Now, the beaver, of course, is a keystone species. The ruff and the spotted crake are the beneficiaries of that keystone species. They can only inhabit shallow wetlands in order to breed and nest successfully. Of course, the beaver is the very best creator of such habitats. So in order to bring back what we have lost, it can be a daunting and terrifying task if we don't break it down into a number of more workable stages. Stages that we can all think about working in small areas, not just in, enormous areas like, Snowdonia, the Norfolk Broads, or of course the Scottish Highlands. So the first problem that we need to address is one that is very difficult to see because it isn't there. And you might think that's a very strange thing to say, but here we have two pictures. We have an eastern Polish riverside farm at the top, and we have a sort of conventional UK cattle herding landscape at the bottom. The difference lies in food, or in our country, the lack of food for wild animals to eat. We have pumped our cattle so full of avermectins that the very ground is sterilized. Dung beetles cannot exist in most modern cattle fields in this country. Of course, in Poland, they have no such problem. Without deep ploughing the soil, of course, you have the formation of anthills. You have cutworms in the ground that feed starlings. The anthills feed wrynecks. The ground invertebrates feed yellow wagtails. So even a farmland environment can be home to an extraordinary abundance and diversity of life, but only if it is mimicking the natural processes that once existed. Once you reach the intensive chemical stages of farming, all of those species that you will see commonly on a Polish farm, Rhineck, redback shrike, are not only extinct in farmland in the United Kingdom, but they are extinct in the United Kingdom, period. So, food for thought. We need to think about quite how many insects birds like cuckoos need in order to survive at all. And on average, a single pair of cuckoos needs in excess of 22,000 caterpillars to get through the course of summer. But of course, cuckoos cannot exist as island populations, as we're finding in the west of England. If you have one cuckoo or two cuckoos, it's not enough. You need a lot of cuckoos in one place. And indeed, the last cuckoo stronghold that I'm aware of, ironically, is the scrubland of Oldbury Power Station, where you have an enormous supply of invertebrate food, as well as reed warblers in which the cuckoo places its nest. But to have a population of cuckoos in a landscape, you need more like 2 million caterpillars. And we should always be looking at our landscapes and our habitat plans with a view to food, to feeding the birds that we love and want to protect, not with bird feeders, but with the habitats that create the invertebrates that these species need in order to survive. Where possible, we should always look to bring back animals that can do the job for us. Obviously, the return of the wild boar to the Forest of Dean has seen a much more diverse landscape emerge. More wallows, more little pools for amphibians, more broken areas, more orchids, more butterflies because of the flowers growing in the wake of the boar. We've become very human-centric in conservation, and in my view, we need to get back to remembering which animals, beavers being a classic one for the west of England, do the job even better than we do. Where possible, and this can be a challenge, especially in the west of England, we need to think about scale. This, for example, shows how cuckoos are surviving on Dartmoor. They are surviving in a large area as a large population. Often fragmentary populations, island populations, are already doomed to die out. So if possible, we should always be trying to concentrate our money and our resources in the areas that join up, whether that is simply a corridor beside a motorway, a railway line, connected woodlands via hedgerows. It doesn't really matter what the shape of the landscape is, but it does matter that it is connected. The final thing we need to remember is that birds often are unable to recolonize by themselves due to the complexities of something known as natal homing, which I go into detail in Rebirding, Chapter 6. And basically, we are not going to see black terns, wrynecks, redback shrikes, or Dalmatian pelicans recolonizing the west of England because they weren't born there and therefore they don't know to migrate there in summer to breed. Which means that we need to move avian science forwards enormously in order to be able to reintroduce these species. It's no good creating these wonderful landscapes that look nice, that are biodiverse, if we're not actively putting species back into them, whether that's the stag beetle, the wryneck, the swallowtail butterfly, of course, all of which could be doing very well in the south, all of which could be doing well in the west of England in the future, but not without human intervention for the good. One thing we should always be thinking about is not just being happy with trees. Oh, somebody's planted a woodland, that's a good idea. We need to be far more critical in looking at those woodlands and asking ourselves, are these simply timber crops? Most of the Forest of Dean is a timber crop. It is not a functional woodland. This is why we're seeing so many woodland bird extinctions in the Forest of Dean. It's not an absence of trees, it's an absence of the right trees in the right configuration of maturity, of diversity, of fruiting species, of species like willow and birch that may not necessarily have commercial importance, but should nonetheless be in the landscape. And, in my view, the Forestry Commission, as our largest landowner, and many private forestry companies have an obligation to be planting in a much more eco-friendly way. So we're talking no to spruce, yes to more pine potentially, and birch in particular. And of course, we do need our some of our woodlands do need to be commercial, but we also need woodlands that are simply there for biodiversity and ecotourism as well. Otherwise, keystone species, willow, oak, birch, crabapple, hawthorn, blackthorn, are going to be increasingly absent from the landscape. And those are species of tree that come with a whole host of specialist birds attached. And until we put back that more jumbled, chaotic woodland landscape, we are going to continue to see catastrophic woodland bird declines in the UK, which remain by far the worst in Europe. It's not just about planting trees, it's about planting the right trees. One thing that I suggested in rebirding is that we split our woodlands into two. We obviously need areas of high productivity pine, and if we must, spruce woodland for timber, but that we also have forests that are driven from ecotourism and from and are seen as sinks of biodiversity in their own right. Forests where beavers and boar are left in charge, whether that's in very large enclosures or ideally not in any enclosures at all. And this is the kind of aspiration that we need. It all sounds far-fetched, but you've got to remember we are simply talking about what Germany, Estonia, Poland have done decades ago. The widespread restoration of beavers in the United States began in the 1940s. So we are very behind. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to constantly think about not dwelling on the obstacles to nature restoration, but working out how we can proactively push it forwards, and catch up with the rest of Europe. So a final slide showing, what a woodland could be and what a woodland shouldn't be, in my view. The top, we will have all have seen in the west of England, the dark, shady, single species plantation. The bottom is one of the northern stretches of the New Forest, one of the most beautiful woodlands that we have left. And you'll see an extraordinary jumble of trees. The formations are varied and diverse. They're free growing in sunlight. They're growing where they want to grow. And this is not the result of planting trees. This is the result of regeneration over, in the case of the New Forest, hundreds of years. So we must always be looking to create places that can grow themselves. Places like even the scrublands of Oldbury Power Station, still one of the most diverse places that I know in the west of England, absolutely hooching with birds. Chaotic scrubland that is allowed to develop by itself. Woodland that regenerates by itself. Grasslands that are governed by the actions of small herds of grazing animals, rivers that are governed by the actions of beavers. And it's that level of aspiration that we are going to need if we are going to genuinely turn the dire fortunes of wildlife in this country around.